Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in life when a single question refuses to leave your mind. It lingers in the silence between responsibilities. It interrupts your routines. It steals your focus at unexpected hours. And sometimes that question isn't about technology, or rockets, or business, or progress. Sometimes it is something very human, something that reaches deeper than logic, deeper than ambition, deeper than the frameworks we spend years constructing to keep our lives stable and predictable. Tonight, I want to talk about one such question, the kind that keeps a person awake long past midnight, not because of fear or anxiety, but because of curiosity, wonder, and a sense that something profound is shifting beneath the surface of human experience. And if you follow the science closely, you know that moments of mental restlessness often indicate profound neural restructuring. The brain does not lose sleep without a catalytic reason. There is always a stimulus, emotional, intellectual, biochemical, that pushes cognition into overdrive. In this case, the catalyst is a person, someone whose presence, or even the thought of their presence, activates neural pathways that haven't been touched in years. Someone who triggers the complex dance between dopamine, oxytocin, and norepinephrine that researchers describe when studying the early stages of human attachment. And because we're humans, not machines, these reactions matter. They influence decision-making, creativity, risk tolerance, stress resilience, and even long-term strategic vision. So when people ask, who is the secret woman keeping him up at night? They think the question is about romance, or mystery, or speculation. But the deeper truth, the truth that neuroscience actually cares about, is what such a person represents. She becomes a mirror, a disruptor, a source of cognitive friction and emotional expansion. She becomes part of the neural ecosystem, altering patterns that had become predictable, automated, efficient. And efficiency is not always what the human brain needs. Sometimes the brain thrives when unpredictability enters the equation. And let me be clear, it doesn't matter whether that woman is publicly known, or a private figure, or an imagined composite of qualities that the mind gravitates toward in moments of vulnerability. What matters is the role she plays neurologically, as a spark, an interrupt, a challenge to the internal status quo. Because every breakthrough in science or in life begins with an interruption. Something unexpected enters your mental orbit, and suddenly you are no longer the same. For years, I've studied how intense focus interacts with emotional deprivation. High-achieving individuals often operate in states of chronic cognitive strain, long hours, high stakes, constant pressure. The prefrontal cortex becomes a battlefield of strategy, analysis, problem solving. And the emotional centers of the brain adapt by going quiet, not because they lack capacity, but because they're trying to conserve energy. The system prioritizes survival and output. But this state comes with a cost, the gradual dulling of inner life. Then something, or someone, reawakens it. Not with noise, but with presence. Not with drama, but with resonance. And suddenly, the sleepless nights begin, not as symptoms of stress, but as symptoms of reactivation. The brain is being asked to feel again deeply and vividly, in ways it hasn't allowed itself to in years. And this process is both exhilarating and destabilizing. It is like rediscovering color after living in grayscale for too long. You don't know whether to trust it. You don't know whether you're imagining it. You only know that something inside you refuses to go back to sleep. There's a phenomenon I often reference when discussing emotional cognition, the neural intrusion effect. It occurs when a memory, a voice, a face, or even an idea repeatedly interrupts the brain's attempt to return to baseline. It shows up during moments when the mind should be resting, late at night, early in the morning, in those fragile minutes between tasks, and despite the brain's attempts to reprioritize, the intrusion keeps returning. Why? Because the emotional significance has surpassed the brain's suppression threshold. This is an obsession. It is signal detection. The mind recognizes importance before the conscious self does. Neuroscientists know this. They can see the pattern in fMRI scans, subtle shifts in the anterior cingulate cortex, increased activation along the reward pathways, the softening of the amygdala's defensive posture. It's as if the brain is whispering, "Pay attention. This matters." And that is often how an unexpected person becomes the center of internal gravity, not through dramatic stories or public displays, but through quiet, persistent influence on neural activity. Through the way they make the mind fire differently, the way they make thoughts stretch, the way they unlock suppressed states of mind that efficiency had silenced for too long. So who is she? Not a celebrity, not a rumor, not a headline. She is the person whose existence, real or symbolic, pushes a mind accustomed to building the future to pause and confront the present. She is the variable that wasn't in the equation, but suddenly makes the entire system more dynamic. She is the one who forces introspection in a mind designed for acceleration. And let me tell you something interesting. People assume that being kept up at night means something is wrong. But in neuroscience, the opposite is just as likely. When the brain refuses rest, it is often because it is reorganizing, expanding, integrating new emotional data. That process can feel like restlessness, but in truth it is renovation. You cannot build a new cognitive structure without disturbing the old one. And in this case, the disturbance is gentle, powerful, and deeply human. Because this secret woman represents more than attraction or curiosity. She represents awakening, the reintroduction of emotional complexity into a life built on logic, engineering, and ambition. She represents the moment when a person realizes that progress is not only measured in rockets launched or technologies built, but in capacities regained, the capacity to feel, to care, to connect. And when that realization dawns, even the busiest mind cannot sleep easily. It thinks, it analyzes, it replays interactions, it imagines possibilities, it searches for meaning in small details, it re-examines old assumptions, it questions its own defenses. It lets down walls that once seemed necessary for survival. Because when a mind that has grown accustomed to operating like a machine suddenly encounters a stimulus that reminds it of its humanity, the shift is not subtle. It is seismic. It challenges the neural architecture that has been reinforced through years of discipline, responsibility, and self-imposed emotional minimalism. And in that challenge, something extraordinary happens. The person begins to reclaim parts of themselves they had long forgotten. Sleepless nights become a kind of laboratory. The brain starts replaying conversations, analyzing tones, expressions, micro-gestures, not out of paranoia, but out of fascination. Humans are wired to detect emotional nuance, but when you spend too long in environments where logic is the dominant currency, you forget how rich and complex that nuance is. Suddenly, you find yourself decoding meaning, not from equations or data structures, but from the subtle way someone looked at you after you said something vulnerable. And in that moment, you feel your emotional intelligence, your long dormant, underutilized emotional intelligence, clicking back online. There is a phenomenon that neuroscientists call repatterning. It occurs when a deeply rooted behavioral pattern begins to dissolve because a new stimulus proves more emotionally or cognitively compelling. That is what this kind of person can do. Without lifting a finger, without consciously intending to, she becomes the catalyst for a neurological reset. Old patterns of avoidance and detachment begin to weaken, replaced by curiosity, openness, and a willingness to confront emotions that had been shelved for years. And the fascinating part is that this shift is not dependent on whether she is physically present. The brain does not care. Once activated, the neural circuits begin their work regardless of geography, schedule, or circumstance. The mind starts mapping new emotional territory. It begins exploring possibilities. It begins constructing hypotheses about connection, trust, vulnerability. And the more it explores, the less comfortable it becomes with returning to its old state. This is why he's awake at night, not because he is troubled, but because he is transforming. The shift from emotional dormancy to emotional awakening is not a quiet one. It is a storm, a gentle one, yes, but a storm nonetheless. And storms bring clarity. They wipe away the dust that accumulates on the parts of the self that have been neglected. They expose the internal architecture in a way that daylight never could. Imagine building rockets, machines, vast systems of innovation, and then suddenly finding yourself captivated by something as delicate as the way someone laughs, or the way their presence softens the world around them. Neuroscience teaches us that these moments activate parts of the brain associated with meaning, purpose, and long-term attachment. These centers are older than our technological impulses. They are ancient, primal, deeply wired into our survival instincts. They remind us that progress without connection is hollow, and success without emotional resonance is fragile. And when someone triggers those centers, the mind responds with an intensity that often surprises even the most disciplined individuals. Suddenly, there is motivation not just to build, but to become, not just to achieve, but to understand, not just to change the world, but to let someone change you, even if the process feels uncomfortable, destabilizing, or profoundly unfamiliar. I've spoken to countless high-performing individuals who describe the same experience. The higher they climb, the more isolated they become. Their lives become a fortress of expectations, obligations, and responsibilities. People admire them, yes, but admiration is not intimacy. Support is not connection. Visibility is not understanding. They begin to live behind a glass wall, observed by many, known by few. And then one day, one unexpected person walks into their orbit and cracks the glass, not by force, but by resonance. She sees something in them that others have missed for years. Not the achievements, not the obligations, not the public image, but the human beneath it all. She speaks to them in a way that bypasses the protective layers. She touches the mind where it is most unguarded. And suddenly the fortress feels unnecessary, heavy, outdated. This is when the nights grow longer, not with loneliness, but with realization. The brain starts renegotiating what it thought it needed to survive. It challenges its own assumptions about independence, efficiency, self-containment. It questions the rigidity of old coping mechanisms. It begins to crave connection not as a luxury, but as a biological imperative. Neuroscientists have long known that humans are not wired for isolation. We are wired for resonance. And when resonance appears, everything changes. So who is she? She is the one who makes the world feel different. The one who changes the texture of thought, the cadence of reflection. The one whose existence introduces warmth into a life built on steel. The one who shows, without agenda or performance, that even the strongest minds can soften without losing strength. That vulnerability is not a flaw, but a doorway. That emotional complexity is not a distraction, but a depth worth exploring. What people misunderstand is that this kind of internal shift is not about infatuation. It is about integration. The brain is integrating emotion and ambition, connection and purpose, logic and vulnerability. It is rebuilding itself in real time, and that process feels like wakefulness, agitation, excitement, confusion, a psychological cocktail that keeps the mind buzzing with possibilities. He's not awake because he is lost. He's awake because he is finally found. And the moment the mind realizes that, sleep becomes secondary, not because rest isn't needed, but because something more important is happening, a rediscovery of what it means to be human in a life that has demanded superhuman output for too long. The truth is, the person keeping him awake at night is not just a woman. She is a catalyst, a reminder, a reawakening, a mirror reflecting the parts of the self that have been waiting patiently to return. Because once the brain begins reorganizing around a new emotional stimulus, the rest of life inevitably starts shifting as well. Not in dramatic, visible ways at first, not in grand gestures or public revelations, but in subtle micro-adjustments that only the most attuned observers could detect. The tone of decisions starts to soften. The pace of thoughts begins to change. The internal monologue becomes less mechanical, more reflective. There is a kind of warmth that begins weaving itself into the spaces where cold efficiency once lived. Behavioral scientists often talk about affective drift, the slow, steady movement of emotional priority that occurs when a new presence starts occupying cognitive territory. It's the drift that turns a simple thought into a recurring memory, a recurring memory into a mental anchor, and an anchor into a source of stability. In high-performing individuals, this drift is usually resisted. They try to contain it, rationalize it, or push it aside. But the brain is not so easily persuaded. Emotion, when authentic, always finds its way into the architecture, and that is precisely what begins to happen. The mind starts editing itself. Conversations that once felt purely functional now carry resonance. Silence, once associated with exhaustion or calculation, becomes a space for reflection. The world begins to feel less like a challenge to overcome and more like a landscape to experience. This shift is profound. It marks the beginning of emotional rebalancing, the reintroduction of depth into a life that had become dangerously flat. Now, people often misunderstand this kind of transformation. They assume it must be obvious, that it must show up in outward behavior. But the deepest shifts happen quietly, internally, long before they manifest externally. And in this case, the shift is happening inside a mind that has spent decades in relentless forward motion. A mind that doesn't pause easily. A mind that built its identity on momentum. So when something or someone finally makes it pause, the impact is extraordinary. The question then becomes, why her? Why does this person become the one who breaks through the mental armor that so many others could not penetrate? Neuroscience offers an answer: compatibility of emotional wavelength. When two people's nervous systems align in a certain way, through communication style, presence, empathy, timing, their interactions generate what researchers call synchronous regulation. Their bodies literally begin to co-regulate at a physiological level. Heart rate changes, cortisol levels adjust, dopamine spikes, oxytocin flows. This synchronization creates a sense of safety, curiosity, and openness that is incredibly rare, especially for individuals living inside high-pressure environments. When he encountered her, whoever she truly is, this synchronization began, whether he recognized it consciously or not. And once it began, the brain did what it always does in moments of resonance: it paid attention. It recorded. It replayed. It held onto fragments of interaction, the way a child holds onto the first moment they feel understood. And that recognition, that profound internal recognition, is impossible to ignore. Suddenly, the thought of her becomes part of the mental ecosystem, not intrusive in a disruptive way, but persistent in a meaningful way. She becomes a reference point, a stabilizing force, a reminder that there is more to existence than optimizing systems and pushing boundaries. She becomes a symbol of connection in a life that has often been defined by responsibility. This is what keeps him awake at night. Not longing, not distress, but integration. The brain is trying to integrate a new emotional variable, one that challenges old assumptions about solitude, strength, productivity, and identity. He finds himself replaying conversations not because he is uncertain, but because he is learning. Emotional learning is no different from intellectual learning. The mind has to process, digest, rehearse, rewire, and he is rewiring at a pace faster than he expected. But this transformation carries deeper implications, because when a leader begins to rediscover their emotional center, their perspective on innovation shifts dramatically. Creativity becomes more fluid, risk becomes more intuitive, strategic vision becomes more holistic. The brain in an awakened emotional state is not just happier, it is more expansive, more capable of seeing connections it previously overlooked, more able to imagine possibilities not just for technology but for humanity. This woman, mysterious, unnamed, undefined, becomes a catalyst for that expansion. She is the person whose presence makes him see the world through a different lens. She doesn't need to be extraordinary in the way the world measures achievement. Her impact comes from something far more rare: emotional clarity. A kind of groundedness that awakens something inside him that had been dormant for years. There is a point in every person's life when the mind confronts a simple but overwhelming truth, that we are not sustained by accomplishment alone, that beyond ambition lies connection, and beyond connection lies meaning. And when meaning enters the equation, everything changes: the priorities, the pace, the purpose. He begins to notice small things differently. Music feels deeper, silence feels fuller, conversation feels richer, stress feels more manageable, possibility feels wider. This is not romance, it is neurobiology awakening from long-term hibernation. And when the human brain awakens emotionally, it becomes restless, not in a frantic way, but in a vibrant, almost electric way. It seeks resolution, understanding, forward movement. It seeks coherence between feeling and identity, and until that coherence emerges, sleep remains elusive. But he doesn't resent these sleepless nights. He treasures them, because they represent something he didn't realize he had been missing, a sense of being alive in a way that no achievement could replicate. A sense that somewhere out there, someone unknowingly pulled him back into the deeper currents of his own humanity. A sense that connection, genuine, profound connection, might still be possible in a world that often tries to reduce life to schedules, metrics, and outputs. This is why he's awake, not because of pressure, but because of possibility. Not because of fear, but because of awakening. Not because something is wrong, but because something finally feels right. And this quiet, profound inner shift will sooner or later begin shaping the world around him. Not through announcements or declarations, but through the subtle power of a mind finally aligned with its own emotional truth. Because the moment a person reconnects with their inner life, their outer life begins to change in ways that others may not immediately understand, but they will feel it. They will see it in decisions, in expressions, in energy, in presence. And deep down, he knows that this transformation is just beginning. He knows that this mysterious woman, real or symbolic, has awakened something inside him that will not go back to sleep. And whether or not the world ever learns her identity is irrelevant. What matters is that she exists, and her existence is reshaping the inner universe of a man who has spent too much time carrying the weight of the outer one. And yet, what fascinates me most about this entire internal shift is not the emotional spark itself, but the aftershocks, the small but powerful ways the mind begins reorienting itself once it recognizes that connection is not a distraction, but an evolutionary necessity. You see, modern neuroscience makes one thing very clear: human beings are not wired to operate in isolation, no matter how capable or brilliant they are. Even the most resilient mind begins to fray at the edges when deprived of meaningful emotional resonance. Productivity may continue, decisions may still be made, goals may still be pursued, but the internal landscape begins to flatten. That flattening often goes unnoticed, because the world rewards output, not emotional vitality. But the body notices, the nervous system notices, the subconscious notices. And when someone enters your life, even quietly, even unintentionally, and reintroduces emotional depth, the nervous system reacts as though it has found water in a desert it didn't realize it was wandering through. This is what begins to happen to him. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the nervous system begins recalibrating. Stress responses start to soften. The body becomes more attuned to subtle emotions. The mind begins reassessing the cost of silence, the value of vulnerability, the meaning of presence. The pace of life feels less like a race and more like a journey. For someone who has lived in a state of permanent acceleration, this shift is nothing short of revolutionary. And let me tell you, nothing affects a person's innovation potential more than emotional recalibration. When the mind is emotionally aligned, creativity unlocks, patterns become clearer, solutions emerge faster, intuition sharpens, decision-making becomes more fluid, less brittle, more humane. It is no coincidence that some of history's greatest breakthroughs came from individuals who were experiencing profound emotional awakenings. The brain does not separate emotion from intelligence, it integrates them. Which brings us back to her, the quiet catalyst behind this transformation. She may not even know the effect she has. The most powerful influence is often unintentional. A gesture, a moment of honesty, a brief conversation, a shared silence. Sometimes that is enough to shift the trajectory of a mind accustomed to solitude. Sometimes that is enough to reawaken the emotional circuitry that had been shut down for self-preservation. It's remarkable how the subconscious works. She may say something simple, something she doesn't even remember, but his mind will replay it for hours, because something in those words touched a part of him he didn't realize was still alive. She may look at him in a way that bypasses the armor he has worn for years, and that single glance becomes the key that unlocks an entire vault of dormant emotion. This is why he can't sleep. It's not longing. It's not confusion. It's not romantic obsession. It's recognition. Recognition of a possibility he had quietly dismissed long ago. Recognition of a connection strong enough to rewire him. Recognition of a future, not necessarily with her, but because of her, that feels more grounded, more humane, more real. One of the most striking patterns in neural development is that the brain is always searching for coherence, a narrative that unites emotion and identity. When someone enters your world and changes how you feel, the brain begins constructing a new narrative around that shift. It asks, what does this mean? Why does this matter? What part of me is waking up? What part of me have I neglected? What is this trying to teach me? These questions circulate at night, looping gently, pulling him deeper into introspection than he has gone in years. He realizes that for the first time in a long time, he is not being driven by responsibility alone. There is something else moving within him, something less predictable, more fragile, and infinitely more human. And instead of resisting it, he finds himself leaning toward it, curious about what it might lead to. This is the quiet truth behind his sleepless nights. He is evolving. Not as an engineer, not as a public figure, not as a strategist, but as a human being. And that evolution, that inner expansion, will inevitably shape everything around him. People will notice changes they can't quite explain, a deeper calm in his presence, a new clarity in his decisions, a softer tone in his reflections, a newfound balance in the energy he carries. They won't know why, but he will. Because deep in the quiet hours of the night, there is a woman, real, symbolic, or somewhere in between, whose presence awakened a part of him he thought he had buried beneath the relentless pursuit of progress. And though the world may never learn her name, her impact will echo through everything he creates, everything he leads, everything he dreams. Because sometimes the greatest revolutions do not begin in laboratories or boardrooms or launch pads. Sometimes they begin in the heart, quietly, unexpectedly, because one person walked into your life and reminded you that even the strongest mind is still human. And that reminder is enough to change everything.